Hello and welcome to the video. My name is Corey David Barker. A little bit of a background about myself. I have a master's degree in social science and informatics from Antioch University Midwest, and I am currently a PhD candidate in cognitive science and human-computer interaction at Jyväskylä University in Finland. So I've been working on this idea for about 20 years, and the reason why it's taken 20 years is because the architectonic of simulation has to do with fitting together everything that everyone understands about everything. And this is not something that you can do overnight. In order to say anything with confidence, you have to know about a lot of things. And so that's how I spent my late teenage years, and that's how I spent the entirety of my 20s, was going to the library and reading up on everything I could about everything and being really organized about that. And then when I went to school, I sort of like carried over those skills that I had, and then I started to approach it from an academic context. So before I begin with this presentation, there's something that I think is important to put forward, which is that I want the audience to be aware of the fact that I try to be really balanced about how I make sense of this model, because this model has to do with everything everybody understands about everything and how to fit it together into some sort of a coherent model. And in doing so, I recognize that this is just me, in my mind, understanding things, and that I can only really improve by integrating everybody else's ideas. So while I hope that I have really gotten right a lot of these things that I talk about, I'm still very much open to any kind of debate or criticism that anybody has about the ideas, because it's only through looking at things differently that we can find the commonalities between different ideas. All right, part one, Introduction to Architectonics and Simulation. So in this part, I'm going to answer three questions. What is an architectonic? What is simulation? And what is the architectonic of simulation? So first question. What is an architectonic? So there's a simple definition and there's a complicated definition. So the simple definition is just simply to say that an architectonic is a way of fitting together everything known. The complicated definition is an architectonic as a model that accounts for, describes, and puts into arrangement all cognition by their natural relation. It's helpful to relate architectonics to other kinds of lexicons that we have, so that we can make distinctions about what architectonics is and what it does differently than these other kinds of lexicons. So dictionaries give simple definitions about what things are, and they organize things by the alphabet. Encyclopedias are similar to dictionaries in that they organize things by the alphabet, but they're different because they give a more detailed description about things. Thesauri, on the other hand, organize things by synonym and antonym, or by similarity and difference. And in many cases, thesauri will have some sort of a larger scale framework in which they organize synonyms and antonyms, but they don't have any definitions and they don't really have any formal theory about how human understanding all can fit together into some sort of a coherent framework. They're more just for reference in finding words that are related to each other or ideas that are related to each other in isolated cases. Now, architectonics is different from dictionaries, encyclopedias, and thesauri, because while they include definitions about what things are, they don't organize things by alphabetization. They organize things by the natural relationships between the cognitions, or the internal experience or representation that people have about phenomena. Now, the general idea about accounting for everything and fitting together everything we know goes by a lot of different names, and I've listed some of these below, like theories of everything, perennial philosophy, transdisciplinary, integral theories, epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, process philosophy. But the reason why I chose to use the word architectonic is because there was a guy by the name of Immanuel Kant, who we'll talk a little bit about later, and he used the word architectonic with a definition of having a schema to organize all human cognition. And I felt that that was the closest idea of all the people that I've read that share in common the approach that I have in terms of how I go about understanding theories of everything. And so that's where the term architectonic derives in my use. Second question, what is simulation? Okay, so again, I have a simple definition and a complicated definition. So the simple definition is that simulation is a representation within an entity about itself and environment. And the complicated definition is complicated because we can start talking about the actual components of what simulation actually is. So the complicated definition starts out by saying that simulation is the system of simulacra within an entity. Okay, so then we have to ask the question, what is simulacra? Well, the simulacra is the combination of simulacrum. It's the plurality of simulacrum. So we have to ask, okay, well, what is simulacrum? Well, simulacrum is the attribute of experience. It is the fundamental unit of experience. So this is kind of abstract, and I'm sure that for many people who are in the audience listening to this, it's going to seem like a foreign concept, and there might not be any direct associations that one might have so that they can relate it directly to their own experience. But just consider it like this. We all share in common a similar biology. And so we all share in common similar building blocks in our biology, right? And this includes things like organelles making up cells, and the cells making up tissues, the tissues making up organs, and the organs making organ systems. And then all of our organ systems all combine together to make the whole organism that we are. And across our organ systems, we have a particular kind of organ system that we call the nervous system. And the nervous system interfaces with all of our other organ systems. And at the most fundamental cellular level, we have particular kinds of neurons that perform certain kinds of functions. And these functions that they serve produce very specific attributes of experience. And these attributes of experience in a neurological context have relationships with other neural systems, and then these become simulacra experience. So the plurality of all of these different neural interactions that we have all combine together into the overall totality of our experience, which I call simulation. So the third question, what is the architectonic of simulation? So once again, I'll have a simple definition and a complicated one. The simple definition is that the architectonic of simulation is a way of fitting together everything that is simulated across simulations. And the complicated definition is that the architectonic of simulation is an account, description, and arrangement of all simulacra by their natural relation across simulations. So what's great about this is that when we're talking about simulation, we are kind of stepping outside of just talking about people, because we can now use a sort of generalized terminology to talk about how any kind of entity, whether it's a human being or whether it's some kind of animal or even a computer, is simulating itself and its environment. And we don't need to get caught up in the problems associated with cognition or with knowledge. So we can use this language across any kind of entity that has an internal representation of itself and or environment. What makes the complicated definition complicated is that there are well-defined requirements that need to be met in order for something to be considered an architectonic. It has to count, describe, and arrange all simulacra that is within its system by the natural relations between them. And it has to be able to do this across all known simulations and their simulators. So what sets us apart from all the other sort of theories of everything that have previously existed is that it doesn't have anything to do with what is true or false. And I know that seems like a sort of contradictory thing to say when talking about a model that accounts for everything that everybody understands and experiences and represents, but it's important to convey that the Architectonic of Simulation as a model isn't built with the intention to make truth claims about what's real. The purpose of the model is to account, describe, and arrange all simulacra by their natural relations. And so therefore it's more of a lexicon or a taxonomy than it is some kind of theory about what's true. And it might seem contradictory to be proposing this model that accounts for everything that everybody understands about everything, and then say, okay, but I don't mean for it to be making truth claims. But it's supposed to be a lexicon, and if we take a dictionary, for example, as a kind of a lexicon, and then a dictionary has words, and then the words have different definitions that people give to those words. A dictionary doesn't say, oh, the first definition is right and the second definition is wrong. No, it includes both of them as different kinds of definitions that people use for that one word. And a lot of the architectonic of simulation is the same way. We include everything that people simulate, and we don't make a truth judgment or a value judgment about the worth of that representation. We just want to account for it, and we want to find the common traits that are shared across the different variations on associated ideas. And we want to figure out how they all fit together by their similarities in a similar way that thesauri do, but we want to do it in a more comprehensive way that fits together everything from the most particular things to the most general. And when people idealize or speculate or hypothesize or theorize or whatever about this sort of thing, they usually call it things like universal taxonomy or a grand unified theory or a theory of everything, a master theory, a spectrum of general to particular, but then also we can also associate this with something like the completeness and incompleteness theorems of Kurt Gödel, which we'll talk about a little bit later, as well as associating it with ideas about the universal code, which has some associations in both fiction and nonfiction, but in terms of being able to account for the entire scope of human experience, then there's the question of whether or not we can make a one-to-one correspondence to mathematics and then implement this in technology. And that's also something we'll get to a bit later. So with that, we will wrap up the first part and move on to the second. Part 2, 4 eras of contribution towards theories of everything. So this is going to be divided into 4 different eras: the Classic era, the Enlightenment era, the Industrial era, and the Information era. The purpose here isn't to give a detailed depiction of every single person who has contributed, just to give some good examples of people who have contributed, and then talk a little bit about what they did that was their contribution. And for anybody who is interested in learning more about any of these folks, I have a slide at the end of the presentation that has all of my references, so if there's anybody in the list that you want to learn more about or know where I got the information from, that's where it's at. In the classical era, it started with Parmenides, who wrote on nature, and in that treatise he talked about eternal realities that existed. And another guy by the name of Heraclitus, he also talked about a similar thing where he was discussing the belief that there were universal forms that persisted amid changes. And then about 100 years later, there was Plato and Aristotle, who both shared in common belief in universal forms. And Aristotle wrote on Concerning First Philosophy. Some people refer to his book as Book Delta, others refer to it simply as Metaphysics. And in that book, he attempted to define universal attributes of human experience and the universe that pervade through the changes. And then there was Herennius Philon, who, to my knowledge, was the first person to write on synonyms, and that was followed by Philo-Judaeus, who was talking about God ideas, and the way that he envisioned it was that God sort of stamped his God ideals into reality like a stamp and seal. And then a while later, there was a guy by the name of Ammonius Grammaticus, and he continued along the lines of synonyms when he wrote on differences of synonymous expression. And then a little bit later, in India, there was a guy by the name of Amarisma, and he wrote a book called Amara Kosha, which translates as the Immortal Collection. And the Immortal Collection was his attempt to account for all of the things that he observed around him and then organize all of that into some sort of a coherent framework. Now, it wouldn't be another 1,000 years until there were any major contributions to large-scale models that accounted for everything. There were some alchemists such as Robert Fludd and Johannes Milius, and they would draw these very elaborate diagrams that would represent everything in the world that existed as a sort of wheel of nature, or a sort of taxonomy of all of God's creations. And then along came René Descartes, and he wrote on Principles of Philosophy, which was an attempt to identify universal attributes that underpin the way that people made sense of things. And at the same time, in approximately the same part of the world, there was a guy by the name of Gottfried Leibniz who came up with a model called the Characteristica Universalis. And although he wrote about it, to our knowledge, we don't actually have any copies of this. So we're not sure if he just discussed the idea of it or he just made one and kept it secret. But Leibniz also came up with something he called a calculus ratiocinator. So today we credit both Descartes and Leibniz for the creation of calculus. And they gave us two different ways, two different notations for writing it. About 100 years later, there was a guy by the name of Immanuel Kant, and he wrote a book called Critique of Pure Reason. And in this book, he presented the idea of an architectonic. This is actually where I borrow the word from. His definition was that it was a systematization of all human cognition, or some sort of a schema for organizing everything that we understand. And he also contributed another idea in this book, which was about fundamental, what he called a priori categories, which were universal experiences that we all share in common. And then about 100 years later, there was George Hegel, and he came up with something he called the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. And he had this idea that there was this thesis, antithesis, synthesis system that repeated over and over and over again across all the building blocks of human knowledge. And so his whole thing was about trying to understand how that worked and trying to apply it to human understanding to define how different domains of knowledge are constructed. About the same time, there was Peter Roget, and he's the guy that gave us the modern thesaurus. And if you read the preface to his original thesaurus, he was pretty clear that he was interested in understanding how all human knowledge fit together, and he thought that it was really useful to give a means for people to see commonality between the different ways that they say things. And he really hoped that his contribution to human knowledge would have a positive effect in that way. And the last person to mention for this era was James Ferrier. He's the guy who coined epistemology. And what makes his approach so interesting is that from the beginning of his idea about it, he saw human knowledge as this sort of iterative thing, and he felt like there needed to be a term that could sort of encompass that, and that's what prompted him to come up with the term. Okay, on to the industrial era. So there's Emily Durkheim, and he proposed something called collective consciousness. And he talked about how there were things that everyone in a certain group shared in common. And then there was Levi Bruhl, who wrote a book called How Natives Think. And he also noticed that there was this recurring theme of collective representations. And he asked a lot of questions about that. And then there was another guy by the name of Carl Jung, and he wrote about collective unconsciousness, how there were universal forms that existed within people that would give different kinds of expression depending on different kinds of experiences or cultures that people were born into. And then we come to Kurt Gödel. So what Gödel did was he showed that you can't have a mathematical axiomatic system that can prove itself. So if you have a mathematical system that is internally complete, it will be externally inconsistent because you need another set of axioms to explain what's going on with the first set of axioms in the internality of that system. And this ended up having a huge impact on a lot of different fields, which I can't really get into here. That needs to go in another video elsewhere. But for now, it led to Alonzo Church coming up with something called untyped lambda calculus. And what untyped lambda calculus was, is it was similar to the calculus, obviously, in which it derives from Descartes and Leibniz, but the difference is that it doesn't have specific types or specific operations. So it can be applied universally across anything that has types or has operations. And Alan Turing was actually one of his students, And Alan Turing applied a lot of his ideas in terms of his philosophy of machine intelligence. But there's one more person to mention in this list whose name is Alfred Tarski. And what Alfred Tarski did is he proposed something called the undefinability theorem. And what the undefinability theorem says is that it's not just for mathematics, but for any domain, any sort of like belief or rule set that you have within that domain cannot define itself. In other words, you can always reflect on your own ideas or your beliefs. So you have like a certain set of beliefs, and then you can think about your beliefs, and then you can define those beliefs in a larger scope of understanding. And you can do that over and over again. And this turns out to just be an essential function of learning and growth. And this brings us to the information era. So there's a guy by the name of Michael Lamport Commons, and he created something called the model of hierarchical complexity. And what the model does is it accounts for, describes, and arranges processes of human development. And it's general theory, so it can apply across any domain of human behavior. There's another guy by the name of Eric Jansch who wrote a book called The Self-Organizing Universe, and in that book he tried to account for all the different building blocks of reality and explain how they all fit together. And then one of the more well-known philosophers of our era is Ken Wilber. And Wilber proposes something called integral theory, and there's a couple different components to it. First of all, he has something called ACAL, which is an acronym for all quadrants, all levels. And what this thing does is it shows how, by looking through things in different ways, the world will look differently to you. And it divides things up between individual and collective versus internal and external. And so this gives you 4 different approaches, and then it becomes a little more complicated beyond that. But then there's also another component, which is his developmental psychology component. And in this model, he looks at a bunch of different development theory models of how people grow and change over their life, and then he tries to find universal patterns that pervade across all these different models in a similar way as what Michael Commons has done. But I'll stop and just say one thing about the difference between them. Ken Wilber's approach to developmental psychology, these sort of universal processes, is more on the qualitative side, whereas Michael Commons' model of hierarchical complexity is more on the quantitative side. So Michael Commons does more in terms of like mathematical measurement, and then Ken Wilber is more on the sort of like transpersonal qualitative side of things. And then we have people like Stephen Hawking and Antony Lisi. And the thing is that these folks refer to their models as theories of everything and grand unified theories. And in no way do I mean to devalue the importance of their contribution, but I think it's an important talking point to mention that their theories of everything are theories of the material universe, of building blocks of matter. And when a person starts to look at other kinds of models that attempt to account for everything that humans experience, we find that the material experience is just one sort of class of building blocks of our experience, and that there are a lot of other domains beyond that. So when thinking about, hearing about, reading about, and talking about theories of everything, it's important to just keep in mind that there are different scopes of theories of everything, and not all of them can be considered architectonic. And there are two more people that I'd like to talk about. The first is Greg Henriquez, who created something called the Tree of Knowledge system. And in his Tree of Knowledge system, he describes these sort of like epochs or these large-scale building blocks that are at the foundation of the universe in all of human experience. And it starts with matter, and then out of matter comes life, out of life comes mind, and out of mind comes culture, and then out of culture comes institutions and science. I thought that was worth including in the list just because it's a modern attempt to account for all the large-scale domains that persist across our experience of life. And then last to be mentioned is Forrest Landry, who wrote a book called Immanent Metaphysics. And in this book, he does something similar to Descartes and Aristotle, where he tries to identify these universal fundamental attributes that underpin all of human experience. Okay, so now we're moving on to part 3, the Architectonic of Simulation. So there are 4 sections to this part. The first section, I'm going to talk about characteristics of the architectonic. And this section is going to give you a general idea of how the model overall fits together. The second section is the universal prototype of simulacra. It describes attributes that recur at every conceivable building block of all simulation. And then the third section will be the 3 orders of simulacra. And the 3 orders of simulacra are the fundamental body of the model itself. And then the 4th section will be a table of the Architectonic of Simulation. So as you might expect, there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot of sort of complicated ideas that I'm going to go over, but I'll do my best to keep it as simple as possible and not overcomplicate things any more than they need to be. Okay, characteristics of the architectonic. So the architectonic is taxonomic, the architectonic is genetic, and the architectonic is fractal. So I know you're thinking to yourself, I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay, well, one thing at a time. First of all, the architectonic is taxonomic ordering of simulacra. So the taxonomy is a spectrum consisting of orders that connect the most universal simulacra that are present throughout all simulations to the most unique one-of-a-kind things that are not. So a basic example of this is that any entity that has an internal simulation of itself and or its environment needs to have some sort of a framework in which can contain that simulation. And we can call that a psyche. And so even though you have your psyche and I have mine, and we both share that in common, there's a difference in our experiences that we've had. You've lived a different life, you've had different experiences because you were born in a different place at a different time, and you know different people, and you're exposed to different things than me. But throughout all that, we still share that common psyche that is the framework that that houses our simulations of our experience. So the architectonic is also genetic. So each simulacra passes down its properties to the descending simulacra in this taxonomy. Conversely, shared properties from an order of simulacra combine into simulacra at the ascending order. So I haven't talked about the orders of simulacra yet, and I'm talking about something I haven't explained, but the way it works is that it's a model between the most universal things and the most specific things. the most unique things. And the most unique things have very unique combinations of characteristics that are specific to that thing and only that thing. But it has common traits or common characteristics with other things, and then that becomes a class of something. And that class has relationships to other classes that have similar characteristics. And there's something in some cases where there's a commonality between them. And so then we can create a new class, and then that class represents the shared properties between those two subclasses. And the architectonic is that way, all the way from the bottom to the top and back down. So the third thing is that the architectonic is fractal. Okay, so fractals are where parts are self-similar to the whole. So an example of a fractal would be like if you have broccoli and you break off a piece of the broccoli and you hold that broccoli branch up to the larger piece of broccoli, the branch is going to look kind of similar to like the larger stalk that you broke it off of. And if you break a smaller branch off of the branch that you broke off, that tinier branch is going to be similar in the way that it looks to the branch that broke off and to the larger broccoli. Well, the thing about fractals is that it's primarily considered mathematical and geometrical in academia. And what I propose is that fractals aren't just quantitative, but they're also qualitative. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So if you take a cell in your body, that cell has it's an anatomical component that is animating with other anatomical components, and then together they form a higher level of organization. Well, that higher level of organization, which might be a tissue, then is its own anatomical unit that is animating with other tissues, and then together they create a higher level of organization of an organ. And so we see a fractal of repeating patterns of self-similarity at each of these building blocks in your organism, where you have anatomical units that are having some sort of animative relationship with other anatomical units that creates a higher level of organization. So within the Architectonic of Simulation, I propose that each simulacra in the entire architectonic is fractal. So everything inherits characteristics from its parent class, and it also gives its characteristics to descending classes that are its children. And when we take the architectonic as a whole model, it is self-referential. It's a fractal of itself. So earlier I had talked about different prominent figures in history who were talking about completeness and incompleteness. Well, this is a related idea because at every moment our version of reality is refreshing. Everything that we have experienced is influencing our perception of everything that we see, and then everything we see is becoming part of our experience. And so it's this recursive fractal process where every new version of ourselves is self-similar to all the parts of ourselves that have developed that have come before that moment. And this also leads into the topic of simulations being able to simulate simulations. And while I have that on this slide, I will just say for now that the Architectonic of Simulation, as I present it, is proposed to incorporate all of the fundamental characteristics that are essential in order for the architectonic to create more versions of itself in a variety of ways. And whether or not a person is religious or believes in God or not, it doesn't really matter because the idea of simulations, having simulations within them, applies in our experience. Like we think about other people's version of reality, and we're doing it. We create computer simulations, and we're creating new simulations that are based on our own attributes. So this is a whole other topic, and I'll get into it in another video, but it's worth mentioning on the topic of the architectonic being fractal. The universal simulacra prototype. So what I propose here is that there is a universal prototype of all simulacra, and the prototype consists of a domain, it consists of modes, and it consists of tessellations. So this gets a little bit dicey to describe because the prototype is everywhere all at the same time in every possible conceivable expression, and it can be kind of hard to nail down the definition because of that, but we can say some things and we can understand it, but it's self-referential. So the domains derive from tessellations from a previous prototype, and then that prototype domain exhibits modes, and the modes are the different ways that the prototype expresses itself, and they iterate into tessellations or some sort of a pattern, and then these tessellations diversify into more domains. So the universal prototype is fractal. So the entirety of the Architectonic of Simulation at every single level of building block and in every single relationship exhibits this fractal. The Architectonic exhibits the universal prototype as the three orders of simulacra, and then the simulacra within each order have their own domains, modes, and tessellation, and then the tessellations of the simulacra are the basis for the descending domains of simulacra prototype. So the entire model is an expression of the prototype. And then each of the orders of the simulacra are having their own prototypes. And then within those, there are even smaller, tiny little prototypes. And so the universal prototype is scale-free. If you understand how the universal prototype works, anything that you experience or represent or make sense of in your mind is going to exhibit the characteristics of the prototype. So the universal prototype seems to derive from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It at once both precedes and precedes all of its variations. So I don't consider it to be within the orders of simulacra because it exists everywhere all at the same time. The universal prototype is the link that binds into a spectrum all the orders of simulacra within the architectonic, and it enables any and every conceivable simulacra to be associated with any other. So if you ever wondered how it is that a person can relate anything to anything else in our minds, that's why, is because they all share the same fundamental characteristics. No matter what the idea is or the experience, we can relate anything to anything else. So you can put an elephant on a flea's back, or you can, imagine yourself, bouncing the moon like a basketball. Like, you can create any relationship between anything you want. There's complete freedom to do it. So there's this sort of juxtaposition between the architectonic being very orderly, but then also enabling complete freeform at the same time for any kind of association or combination of creativity. 3 orders of simulacra. So the 3 orders of simulacra are what I call computation, ratiocination, and instantiation. So computation etymologically comes from the Latin roots cum and putere, which means to think together. So originally, historically, people use the word computer to reference when people are thinking about different things together at the same time. I like the word computer because there's a sort of like ancient understanding about how our way of making sense of the world worked, and modern technology in terms of computer like machines. And part of the reason why I selected the language is so that the kinds of things that I'm talking about with this model can be carried over across both. So we can use the same language to talk about how computers work as we do as people work, as we do as other species. So the domain of computation is recursion, and there's only one domain. It's just recursion. And what this means is that the highest order characteristic of simulations and in turn human experience is recursion. It's processes applying back on themselves. So as I said before, at every moment we're having experiences, and those experiences are applying back on ourselves again and again and again, and we're constantly refreshing our version of reality. And there are three modes to how this works. There's static, dynamic, and multidynamic. So static represents equilibrium, it represents structure, it represents architecture. Dynamic represents change, it represents relationships between things, it represents motion. And multidynamic is a word that I coined as a hypernym for static and dynamic because there was no word that existed. And multidynamic means the combination between static and dynamic at the same time. So the way that the computation works is that there is a static of recursion, and the different static states have dynamic relationships with other static states. And those relationships have relationships with each other as the multidynamic, which creates a higher level order or characteristic of static. And then this process recurses. It repeats over and over and over again throughout all of our biological systems. The tessellations that are derived out of this are object, subject, and another word that I coined called transject. So objects are things that are physical and tangible, and subjects are things that are mental and quasi-tangible. Like you can they're kind of tangible and they're kind of not. And transjects are a term that I coined, which is objects that are ethereal. They're intangible, and they pervade across both objects and subjects at the same time. So the next order of simulacra is called ratiocination, and it comes from the etymology of Latin of ratio and cinere, which means reckoning and to endeavor. Ratiocinators are ways that the computer computes. They are, in the architectonic scope, if computation is the domain of the architectonic, then ratiocination are the modes of the architectonic. And there are three different kinds of domains of ratiocination. There are architectural domains, there are processual domains, and there are calculatory domains. And these domains derive directly from the tessellations of computation. So for the architectural domains, time, space, and energy derive from static transjectivity. Form, matter, and apparatus derive from static objectivity, and psyche, semiotic, and schema derive from static subjectivity. And the pattern holds for the processual domains of ratiocination also. Automation, transduction, and concretion are dynamic object domains. Abstraction, principle, and paradigm are dynamic subjectivity, and panoptic, phasic, and deicic are dynamic transjective domains. Now, when it comes to the calculatory element of ratiocinators, the calculatory domains are any combination between architectural and processual domains. So the architecture of things changes through the processes. And with that, it's worth pointing out that the architectural domains follow a trajectory of building blocks of dependency. And we see the same thing with the processual domains also. They follow a developmental trajectory of increasing complexity. Although there are a variety of ways that the calculations can happen, I think that this is just sufficient enough to communicate the general idea about how ratiocination works. And I can make another video in the future to go in more detail about all of these things. So the modes of ratiocinators are a replication of computation. So just like how recursion has a static, dynamic, and multidynamic mode that tessellates, similarly do ratiocinators. So earlier I gave an example of cells having relationships with other cells which form tissues, and that there's this repeating pattern of anatomical units having animative relationships with other anatomical units, forming a higher level of organization. Well, that fits into ratiocinator domain of the apparatus, because in apparatus, the definition of apparatus is that you have some sort of instrumentation or organization. And so cells would be the static, and the animative relationships would be the dynamic, and then the relationships between all the cells creating a new level of organization as tissue, well then that would be the multidynamic. And you can see how this pattern repeats, it tessellates across all the different building blocks of an organism. And similarly, we can say the same thing about the material domain, where it has static, dynamic, and multidynamic modes. You have substances that have forces between those substances, which creates a higher level of material configuration. And then these building blocks go all the way up from talking about subatomic particles all the way to entire galaxy filaments. And this leads us to the next topic, which is ratiocinator tessellations. So there are shared tessellations across all of the architectural, processual, and calculatory ratiocinators. And they are fabric, particle, chemical, amalgam, telluric, celestial, stellar, galactic, and cosmic. And I think just by looking at the words, you can kind of get a sense of the scale of tessellations that we're talking about, and you can kind of have an understanding of what it is that I am talking about. So this slide already being almost 10 minutes long, I think we can just stop there on the ratiocinator. And then instantiation. The thing about instantiation is that there's an explosion of variation of all the different possibilities that can happen from as domains of these tessellations that I just mentioned for the ratiocinator. And so it's sort of impractical to like really talk about or give some sort of like detailed description of all of the instantiations that could exist. Because if you just stop and look around you, you will see everything around you is an instantiation. It's somehow an expression of one or more of the ratiocinators. The etymology of instantiation just means presence, a fact or a case or an example. So yeah, domains, the instances can be anything and everything that happens in a simulation through ratiocinators. And the modes, each instance has its own occurrences of static, dynamic, and multidynamic. They're just more particular than ratiocinators. And instantiation tessellations, they can be anything. They can literally be anything. Any possible conceivable relationship or pattern that can form from all the things that exist in the world would be all the kinds of instantiations that exist. And there's one more thing that I would like to add at the end of this slide, which is that instantiation is the genesis for new kinds of computation. Instantiation always depends on ratiocinators. They always not just depend on them, they exhibit their characteristics innately in what they are, in the same way that all the ratiocinators are expressions of computation. And in the larger scope of the architectonic, instantiations are the tessellations of the architectonic. Okay, we are finally to the last part, part 4, discussion. So I'm going to try to answer the question why the architectonic is important, why architectonics in general are important. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about implications for human progress, and then finally some concluding remarks for the outro. Why is the architectonic important? So, two things here, the role of architectonics and then roles on multiple scales. So, with the role of architectonics, it's that we have dictionaries, thesauri, encyclopedia, and textbooks, but we need architectonics because it fills a role that none of these can do. It shows how everything we know fits together in the larger scope. We need to get organized about everything we know about everything in a neutral way that holds across all human experience, all domains of knowledge. Architectonics help us make sense of what people simulate and how they simulate it by the universal human experience that we all share as a species. So, in terms of roles on multiple scales, on the individual scale, I think if we have some sort of framework that we can architectonically organize everything that we know and all of our experiences, then we're going to be able to better understand ourselves and in an interpersonal way also better understand other people around us. And in an institutional scale, whether we're talking about different schools of philosophy or different religious practices, or we're talking about different kinds of science, or different kinds of cultures that people come from. There's a lot of different people who have a lot of different ideas about what's real or what should be true or how people should be. And I think if we all had something that we could all make reference to that discusses the universal things that we all have in common, then we could use something like that to better understand our differences and be more clear about why we have those differences by understanding how people construct their ideas and the processes that people go through as they transform them. And I think the same principle applies to the national scale as well. I think we can all agree that the world is full of all sorts of political shenanigans with lots of people wanting things lots of different ways. and people strategize against each other instead of with each other. And I think models like this can help sort of contextualize why things get stuck and help us be really concise, really clear about how to get things unstuck, because we can sort of see where things are at in the larger scope of the overall evolution of the world. And that brings us to the international and the global scale. I think as a species, it's the only place we can really go. I mean, you look at history, it's just a long series of people learning from their experiences and forming better and better versions of reality. And it's for the obvious reason that if your version of reality doesn't match the reality that you mean for it to represent, then you're not going to be able to accomplish your tasks or your goals. And so I think that's motivated people over the eras to create increasingly symmetrical representations in their mind of themselves in the world. And going into the future, as everything has become globalized, I think we need to have global scale lexicons that can organize all the different ways that people make sense of things. Implications for human progress. So first is on organizing knowledge. We exist in a post-information era where more knowledge is being generated than anyone has any hope of possibly keeping up with. And we need a way to organize it so that we can all get on the same page at the same time. So one of the things I'm proposing with this Architectonic of Simulation is that we design a software platform where we have a theory of everything that everybody can participate in. And I'll make a video on this in the near future. And I'll also make a video on the mathematical conversion of the sort of qualitative expression that this model has to something that we can make computable. This is something that is part of my PhD dissertation. And so I'll be posting about that also. The next topic is artificial intelligence. So while we see a lot of progress, the problem is that the systems are built in fragments. They're disjointed from understanding how intelligence processes actually work. And I spent quite a bit of time doing literature searches on this, and I can find almost nothing of people applying developmental psychology to artificial intelligence. And it's really curious to me because how can people design artificially intelligent machines that can act like people if we're not applying the actual like academic work that people have done in understanding the step-by-step process of how people develop across different domains over time. And I think part of the problem is because people who are computer scientists aren't psychologists and or behaviorists, and people who are psychologists and behaviorists are not computer scientists. These are two really, really big fields that take a really long time to learn, and it takes even more effort to even fit them together. So in a way, it kind of makes sense why things are the way they are, but I'm hoping that the Architectonic of Simulation, or architectonics in general, people can start to realize that this is the only way to go forward. In order to make artificial intelligence that is actually like people, we need to have models that model the entirety of the human experience. And if we don't have that, how can we possibly expect to replicate it? So the next topic is the technological singularity. So the technological singularity is also an epistemological one. Humans increment towards increasing symmetry, and all fields are converging. And so I propose that architectonic simulation is our best and current only hope to implement the singularity. What else could it be? So this is something I was talking about with artificial intelligence, but it carries over into the technological singularity in general. Like the Architectonic of Simulation and other efforts that people have made to make architectonics, that is like that they are epistemological singularities, and just saying it in similar language, there's no way we're going to be able to have a technological singularity until we have an epistemological one. And so I hope people can find some use out of this modeling that I'm making, and can see like the implications that it can have, that it must have in order for the technological singularity to happen. And then the next topic is a framework for interacting with sentient alien life. So as our technology advances, we're starting to venture into space, and that's just going to be part of our natural evolution, is we're going to grow beyond this planet. And eventually, there's a pretty good chance, in my view, that we're eventually going to run into alien life. And if we run into alien life, we're going to need to have some sort of unified model of our own capacity for experience that we're going to be able to compare with the capacities of the other species, so that we can make a one-to-one correspondence in order to understand each other. And I think that if we don't have this, and we're using sort of like fragmentary, small-scale models that only explain a small, tiny, part of the human experience, we're never going to be able to have good communication and really understand them, unless they have already developed it themselves, and then we're sort of like behind in that regard. So I feel like architectonics and the Architectonic of Simulation is going to be really, really important when we meet sentient alien life. And then finally, the last is the universe an architectonic simulation? So humans inherit architectonic simulacra from larger simulation in which they belong. So simulations are embedded within simulations. And the way that I've been explaining simulation has a lot of freedom in terms of like how we can use the term, and we can also apply to the universe. And we don't necessarily need to say that the universe is a machine to say that the universe is simulative, when it is self-regulating and self-perpetuating itself recursively. So human, quote, knowledge and, quote, intelligence, I think that they're actually expressions of or variations of these larger universal computational functions. Because how could we interact with the world and accomplish tasks at all if there wasn't some sort of common characteristic between how we architect and process information and how the environment around us is actually architected and actually is processing itself? So is the universe simulated in a computational machine? I honestly have no idea. I don't know how I would even know that. I don't propose to know that. But what we can say is that there are universal simulacra that are true across all simulation, and that says something. It says something about hopefully the truth of reality and the universe and our place in it. So that's the presentation for the Architectonic of Simulation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new. Maybe it inspired some new ideas in you. I plan on making more videos, and in the meantime, if you have any thoughts for, against, or something else, you can go ahead and leave a comment in the section below. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.